The challenge with working in open source at the moment is not so much gaining access to a useful range of inputs as finding a way to deal with the vast amount of data and information that is coming in from that wide range of sources. So if you think of open source information as a spectrum, on one end you have things like social media, where a vast amount of information is produced every single day, more than we could possibly hope to analyse. And a lot of that information is going to be completely irrelevant to us for the purposes of intelligence work. However, there will be buried within that examples of very, very valuable intelligence. So to take one example, at the moment on the screen you can see some pictures that were included in a tweet that was posted by a person on the ground in Syria. And they appear to show the body of a Russian soldier. Obviously this is very timely information. It may be geotagged, it may be reference to a very specific location, and it shows us a variety of equipment that was carried by that soldier at the time of his death. And working with IHS Jane's experts, we were able to analyse those bits of kit, identify them, and from that draw a conclusion about who this soldier was, where he was deployed and what sort of work he might have been doing. So that's one example at one end of the spectrum. At the other end of the spectrum you have things that, while still very much in open source, are harder to use or harder to find. So satellite imagery is a good example of this. Everyone is familiar with satellite imagery from programs like Google Earth, but working at IHS Jane's we have access to imagery analysts who are able to look at the imagery in a much more skilled way. We also have access to imagery that sometimes is of higher resolution or more up to date than the imagery that will be on Google Earth. There are also other forms of imagery such as synthetic aperture radar. Now this takes a very advanced skill set to be able to use correctly, but it's very powerful when that's done. And on the screen now you can see an example of a comparison between traditional electro-optical imagery and synthetic aperture radar imagery. So what we do at Jane's Intelligence Review is bring together this whole spectrum of open source inputs, from things like social media, where the challenge is identifying the pearl of information in that huge output of data, through to things that are, while still open source, a little bit harder to use. What we try to do at Jane's Intelligence Review is bring a wide variety of inputs together on any particular topic to produce something that ultimately is more valuable than the sum of each of those individual parts. To take an example, earlier this year we produced an article about attempts in open source to track the movements of Russian military vessels and aircraft. Now the basis of this was a process of monitoring high-frequency radio broadcasts by Russian aircraft, by Russian naval vessels. And we combined that input in open source with analysis of social media. So for instance, there are a large number of ship spotter and plane spotter websites where enthusiasts will post pictures of particular aircraft in a particular place at a particular time. So that's another open source input. Working at IHS, we're also able to bring in a variety of inputs from inside the company. So we have access to maritime and trade vessel data that shows us where particular vessels have been based on the broadcasts that they themselves put out on the AIS system. And again, we have access to satellite imagery. What this means is that if we bring all these techniques together, we can, for instance, identify a vessel based on a radio broadcast it may have made, track it through the AIS transponder that the ship carries, and identify it, for instance, passing through the Bosphorus on a particular webcam, and then look at satellite imagery to identify it when it's in a particular port. And what this means is that you end up with something that, again, is more than the sum of all the individual parts. And in particular, with this example of Russian military and aircraft and naval vessels, you're moving towards something that, while still very much done in open source, is approximating what used to be the domain of military intelligence or classified intelligence work. We're going to continue to expand the range and the depth of open source inputs that we use and that we bring to bear on the articles that we work on. So to take one example, something that we've looked at a little bit in the past in previous articles are the movements of the Chinese Coast Guard. Now this is an interesting topic because China is using its Coast Guard in preference to vessels from its military, from the People's Liberation Army Navy, to carry out some of the activities that it's engaged in the South China Sea and the East China Sea. Now they're doing this with the Coast Guard vessels because the Coast Guard presents less of a military face than I suppose a military naval vessel would do. However, because they're Coast Guard vessels, they broadcast AIS data, and that means that we're able to look at their positions. Now there have been some examples in Jane's Intelligence Review previously where we've analysed those vessels' positions, for instance, around the Scarborough Shoal. However, looking ahead, one thing that we're thinking about doing is engaging in that analysis in a much more structured fashion, bringing in other sources such as social media, looking at statements that have been made by some of the governments that are party to those territorial disputes in those waters about the activities of Chinese Coast Guard vessels in their waters, and bringing in techniques like analyst dashboards produced in Tableau to really make it much easier and a much more structured way to analyse this data. Now, obviously with all of these processes, our work is evolutionary. Over time we will develop new techniques and procedures for using open source inputs. But again, the benefit for this in terms of our readership is that we're able to increasingly bring more and more inputs to bear on the subjects that they are interested in.